South Korea man. How you doing?
Oh, hello. Can you hear
Hello.
me?
Clearly, yes.
Yes. Okay, I have like two questions and a comment. First, last week I've been listening to Taiwanese commentators, and they recently they said that with the Russian government and Putin has been signaling support for what's called the old guard, Chinese old guard, the Shanghai faction. Russia has been signaling more public support, and this is very. They say it is a very interesting development because even though the Shanghai faction and Russia have a long friendly relationship, Putin has never really signaled support publicly because of the issue with Xi Jinping's faction. And I was wondering, have you heard anything about that on your part?
Nothing at all. I mean, I've heard nothing. I mean, there's been no hint of this in anything in the Russian media. So, I mean, whether there is some, I mean, I don't know what the evidence for this is. I mean, I would have thought at the moment, given that Xi Jinping is very much the person who appears to be in charge, rather than I presume you're referring to Jiang Zemin and his people, I would have thought that they would be sticking with Xi Jinping. But regardless of that, I've heard absolutely nothing about it. And to be completely frank, I would be surprised if the Russians, who obviously need to have China friendly to themselves, especially at this time, would risk involving themselves in Chinese politics in that way. I mean, that's all I can say about it, because I can't really comment more.
My just thought was close relationships are always like a double-edged sword. Each party becomes a stakeholder in each other's internal situations. So I mean, that was just my thought. My second question is, I'm old enough to remember with the EU, or in the early like 90s, the EU had a more aggressive relationship with America, but like in the early 21st century, I think that changed. And now they are more closer, in some manner more closer to US than before in the like the 80s. Am I misremembering it?
You're entirely right. I can remember also when economic and monetary union was announced in Europe in the early 90s. There was quite open talk on the part of some people in Europe that this is a great step to liberate Europe from the US, supposedly, and to establish the European Union as an alternative to the US. And there was actually talk about that, especially in France, much less so in Germany, of course. Certainly not the case in Britain at that time. Britain, of course, was a member of the EU in those days. But there was certainly people who were talking about that. And of course, there was also a time in the 1990s and the 2000s when you had political leaders in Europe like Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, Jacques Chirac, who were prepared to take and positions which were not exactly anti-American, were certainly different from that of the United States on all sorts of issues. Now, that has all crumbled, and I think it's crumbled for two reasons. Firstly, the European project has not done very well. That's putting it mildly, and that's changed the balance of power dynamics to an extraordinary degree. Because I mean, the US now looks much stronger relative to the EU than it did, say, in the early 2000s, or it is stronger with relation to Europe than it did in the early 2000s. But I think the other thing is that the whole European venture became completely absorbed in this, I'm going to say, globalist enterprise, and that has it is still very focused around the US and using US power. So in a way that drew Europe and the EU, where we changed them, and it drew them more closely, much more closely, again, into this symbiotic relationship with the United States. So yes, I would agree. I think definitely the US relative to the EU is now much stronger than it was, and the EU is much more compliant to the US than it was. And of course, the states of Eastern Europe, which joined the EU later, countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and whatever, have other reasons above those to be strongly supportive of the US, because they have this difficult relationship with Russia. And that has given a very strong pro-American lobby within the EU and on the EU Council. So all of these factors are all of these factors are in play. By the way, you're absolutely right in what you said before, that relationships between two independent equals can create many difficulties, and one shouldn't underestimate them. I mean, I was watching, I think I mentioned this in last week's live stream also. I was watching an interview with a Russian scientist called Sergei Boyev, who developed Russia's early warning system, which is basically, to inform the Kremlin if they're attacked by the US. And as is known, the Russians have provided assistance to China with its early warning system. Boyev was clearly involved in all of that. And the clear impression I got was that he wasn't happy about that. He wasn't happy sharing secrets with the Chinese, even though the Chinese are friends. So there's always going to be those tensions, and one shouldn't underestimate them. A wise government in Washington would be trying to, I won't say aggravate tensions, but it would be aware that those tensions are there, and would understand that the Russians might not be entirely enthusiastic about getting too close to Beijing, and would want to preserve a more independent stance. And that might mean taking a more equidistant position between China and the US. But of course, that hasn't happened because the political pressures have made it impossible.
Thank you. One comment related to the Cold War topic. I'm resigned to think that history will follow like classical examples. Since you're all Greek, my example would be Athens was not guaranteed victory by destiny, but Xerxes crossing the Hellespont was destined to be, because of the nature of empire. It will happen because it has to happen, and timing and other conditions will determine who comes out the winner or not. I think that's generally, we have to be resolved to that and find a way how to survive.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is it. I mean, people who think that they have in a position of overwhelming strength often find that they don't. And I mean, going back to some of the comments that were made earlier in this program about the militarization of space, it's a fact that the United States has gradually edged away from many of the treaties that were signed during the Cold War on this very topic, because it assumed that it was stronger and would be able to develop space more. And now what it's finding is that other countries, Russia, but China too, are in a position to challenge it in space in a way that it had not expected. So you have all of these. You can't make the assumption. Wise statesmen never make the assumption that things are definitely going to go their way if they start taking risks. And that's a point which I sometimes do wonder whether people in Washington always understand that. The United States, I'm going to say this, has been a lucky country. It's made its own luck. It's been very stable. It's very energetic, very powerful, but it's also been lucky. It's been lucky in the fact that when it's faced crises before, they've always been manageable. Even big crises like the Second World War, they've always been manageable. They've never really been face to face with a full spectrum peer opponent before, and they've never really faced a real military conceivable military cataclysm before. And, you know, I don't wish it on them at all. I you know, on the contrary, it's been a great thing that there's one country which has avoided all those things, but it does make them, it has a tendency to make them complacent about themselves and to assume that whatever happens, it will always come right for them in the end. And that's a dangerous line of thinking to take. You are from South Korea. You know what happened during the Korean War. You know how the United States found itself in a very difficult position at one point in the Korean War. And that came very close to disaster then. And that would have had terrible consequences for the world. And it didn't quite happen. But there's always risks that you run. If you run too many risks, sooner or later, your luck runs out and you can face huge problems.
Yes, it's interesting because American military history is always disaster and recovery.
Yeah.
They never win in the first place. So that's always a really interesting dynamic they have.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for listening to my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, South Korea, man.